You men and women, okay, Jack, we finally have got to the fourth part here, and we're going to be talking about veterans. There's a lot of people out there that served in the military, and I'm sure you've got a few things to say to those guys. How about this? Do you ever expect a war on this land?
Well, Paul, I think that there's a very, very strong possibility of a war in this country, maybe within the next few years. Certainly, if this situation down in Central America deteriorates, we have a situation developing in America now where many of the illegal immigrants that have come into this country in recent years, including many of the Vietnamese, are nothing more or less than enemy agents. They've been sent over here specifically to infiltrate our society and to stir up internal trouble when the time comes. There's also a great deal of evidence that there are plans underway for actually stirring up this trouble and for the possible taking over of the southwest part of the United States into a Spanish type of speaking country. Yeah. This plan has been underway for at least 8 years that I know of. And there are situations building up at the present time down in Mexico, where Mexico could go communist very easy. And there's some of the military experts on Central America that feel that if we don't stop the inroads of communism in Central America by the end of 1986, that very possibly Mexico could go over into the communist camp. Then we're in real trouble.
I was kind of under the impression they were almost communist already.
Well, they are an ideology. Their leadership is pretty much communist, and most of the labor unions and the people that are influenced by the labor unions, which makes up a great portion of the country, are socialist-oriented.
Well, now, we talked a little while ago that when you say Jew, quite often you're talking communist.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
This fella in Canada who was publishing books questioning the 6 million Holocaust, he was just asking questions whether or not people really believed that there was 6 million was a legitimate figure. And obviously the Jews have such control up there, they had a hate book banning and put the guy in jail because of it. Now it sounds to me like maybe Canada is
Yes, that's right. I have a little rub off of that. There was also another fellow by the name of Jim Keegstra in Alberta, who was a school teacher, a history school teacher in high school, and he didn't question the Holocaust. He said to his students, there is another side to the story, and you ought to hear both sides of the story. And he got fired not only of his job as a school teacher, he got kicked out of the teachers union. He was also fired as the mayor of a small town, and now they're bringing charges against him, and he's trying to defend himself to keep from going to prison. Not because he said anything against the Jews, but because he was bringing up a question of whether or not the story that the people were being told was the truth or not. And it sort of rubbed over on me because last year I went up into Canada at the as a guest of the Canadian League of Rights to speak up in British Columbia. And I had about $5,000 worth of tapes and books that were confiscated by the Canadian Customs. And they also impounded my vehicle for a period of time. And the story was at first that I hadn't paid customs on it, and then when they found out that you didn't pay customs on tapes and literature, they hemmed and hawed around, and finally we got one of the customs men to admit that there was so much pressure against the Canadian government in Ottawa by the Anti-Defamation League of the Libreth that they were under orders to harass me in any way possible while I was there.
Back to the Jews again.
And so I received a lot of harassment. Yeah. Now, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got a letter from a Canadian friend of mine who was taking across the border this book that I have written, which is called Know Your Enemies. And he was taking this across the Canadian border, and they picked it up on him and said, you can't bring that into Canada, that it's considered pornographic literature. But he said, for God's sakes, he said, it doesn't say anything about sex in there. It said, it doesn't matter. We consider it pornographic literature. So he asked them to send him a list of books that were on the prescribed list, They sent him one, and here was my book, Know Your Enemies, right in the midst of about 20 other titles, and most of them were so salacious and dirty that it was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And they considered it pornographic material because of the fact that I was criticizing international Zionism. That was all.
Sounds like we have serious problems above us and below us.
Yes, this is right. There's a great effort going on, has been for a number of years, to drive a wedge between Canada and the United States. Essentially, we are the same background people. We're essentially mostly Anglo-Saxon related people, which we believe are the identity people. We are primarily Christian people in both countries, and there's no reason in the world why we shouldn't live together in the very closest of harmony, because we're people of like beliefs and customs. And there's been a great drive to try and drive a wedge between the Canadian people and the American people in recent years, and it's no doubt in my mind that it's the pushing together of this final plan for the conquering of the country.
Okay, well now, getting back to war then, I was going to ask you, explain how this war that you think is going to come, how it would differ from other wars, but it sounds to me like this could be very similar to our Civil War, where brothers would be fighting against brothers, because one brother would believe in the Jews and another not.
I believe, Paul, I doubt very much that we're going to see a nuclear confrontation between Russia and the United States, for the simple reason that it's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt over the recent years, since 1919, that the communists cannot exist without the aid of Western civilization, particularly the free world, and particularly the United States. There have been at least 15 major occasions that I can recall since 1918 when the Soviet Union has been on the verge of economic collapse. And every single time, it wasn't another communist country that put them on their feet. It was old Uncle Sucker, using our tax money, that put this so-called enemy of ours back on their feet. And time and time and time and time again, we have aided them militarily. We've aided them when they needed food. We've aided them in just about every way possible. We've built them up now to where they probably have a more powerful military machine than we did. And recently, our people in Washington are beginning to recognize we made a bad mistake. Now what are we doing? Last year, the President of the United States says we're going to recognize Red China. Do the same thing with them.
Well, we are doing the very same thing with the Israelis. I've read time after time that if it wasn't for our financial support, they would utterly collapse. And yet they're supposed to be God's chosen people. If there's any people on the face of the earth that should be getting God's blessings, it's them, and they can't exist without our money.
That's right. They never would have become a military power in the Near East. And I think very possibly that this is where we might find a war breaking out. I sort of envision a scenario, something like this, Paul. I think we're going to find the United States military involved in a war of some type. It might be in the Persian Gulf. It could be in the Middle East. It could very, very possibly be in Central America. I think it might be a war that'll be large enough to where the National Guard will be pulled out of the country. Now, here we run into a very ticklish situation, because if the National Guard goes, then the country is almost defenseless from any internal subversion type of a thing.
Well, from my experience, the National Guard's not going to help us anyhow.
Right. Now, last year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation said that they knew of 100,000 or more enemy agents operating within the United States. They know them by name. They know where they're living, but they can't touch them under existing law until they make an overt move against the United States.
Yeah.
They also know that there are countless thousands and millions of illegal aliens in this country, many of them who are enemy agents that have been sent over here specifically. We have many instances of men coming across the Mexican border within the last year and a half. They're not the little obsequious Mexican that we saw 10 years ago coming over looking for jobs. These are young men. They've been military trained. Many of them are carrying large sums of American money. Many of them are carrying sophisticated military weapons, and they're carrying identification papers that show that they have served in the American Army. Some of them are carrying green cards. Some of them are carrying identification cards that shows that they're American citizens. And they're apparently coming over from one reason and one reason only, and that's to stir up trouble in the big cities. At the present time in Kansas City, there's a hotbed of Chicano activity there, And I had the privilege several weeks ago of talking to some of the old Spanish families in Kansas City. These are people that have been in Kansas City for years and years, for generations. They're fine American citizens. They're of Spanish descent, and they are tremendously upset with what they see happening within the Spanish community in Kansas City.
Well, I was just thinking when you were talking, when we were in Vietnam, we couldn't tell Arvin from the Viet Cong. The boat people come over here, put on American clothes. Do we know that those boat people are not Viet Cong?
Well, this is an interesting thing. Last year, one of the top officials of the Vietnamese that came over here made the public statement that they believe it's possible as much as 50% of the Vietnamese refugees are Viet Cong. That's 320,000 of them. And there's a large group of them in a little town called Seadrift, Texas, which is north of Corpus Christi, about 80 or 90 miles. You remember they had some trouble with them in the shrimp down there, and the Ku Klux Klan got involved in it, about a year or so ago. And there's a fellow down there that goes by the name of General LUNC. He claims he's a general in the Viet Cong, and he has openly claimed in the newspapers and on television that he has 2 divisions of armed Viet Cong in that area.
How many men in a division?
Well, it can run anywhere from 8,000 to 16,000. And it's very interesting to note that down in the Delta country of the Mississippi, down south of New Orleans, many, many, many Vietnamese have moved in there. And they have been given by the American government very sophisticated fishing boats. These are big boats. They're 60, 70 feet long. They have twin diesel engines in. They're capable of speeds up to 40 knots. This is much better than anything the Americans have. That's one of the reasons why there's so much friction, because the American government is giving these Vietnamese equipment that the Americans can't afford, and they're running in competition with them. Many of these boats are river patrol boats from Vietnam. And we know at the present time, and have known for at least 2 years, that there are large, large numbers of Russian soldiers or Soviet soldiers in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. With these fast boats, it's a 4-hour run from Mexico up to the Gulf Coast, and they can very easily go down there and bring back 70 men per load. And last year alone, in the Key area of Florida, over 1,200 ocean-going yachts were stolen during a year. And they know that many of them have been worked over and have been armed and have weapons on board now, cannon, fast-firing cannon, and that they're in a position to ferry up troops from Cuba. So evidently something is building up. We're not being told about it. There's been a tremendous movement of mechanized equipment south of the border within the last 6 months period of time. We know there are Russian tanks down there because we have pictures of the Russian tanks with the insignia on the side. We know that there are Russian advisors down there because many, many of the patriotic Mexicans have seen them. We know that there are activity going on in the Baja Peninsula of California, where there are North Vietnamese that have been in there for at least 2 years.
Are these things kept secret from Reagan, or does he know?
I can't but believe that Mr. Reagan, and being an intelligent man, knows some of this. If I can get information like that from clandestine sources, certainly he, with all the efforts of the American intelligence gathering community, must know that these things are going
on. I just wondered if he didn't have all of these CFR and trilateral people surrounding him to the point maybe they were shielding him from.
Well, I think that this has been one of the big problems in American foreign policy over the past 50 years, that many, many times both the Congress and the President of the United States have been kept in the dark about the activities, say for instance, of the State Department. We know that the State Department has deliberately withheld very, very important information from the Congress of the United States and from the American people, and many times the news that does get down to the American people is so carefully laundered that we really don't understand what's happening.
If I sent a copy of this tape to President Reagan, what's the odds of him getting it?
I would say very small.
There's
no doubt in my mind at all that it would be picked up before it ever got to him, and either go into file 13, or else your name would go on a list.
Yeah.
Probably that's what would happen.
They would hit it with a demagnetizer and erase it and then give him a blank tape.
That's probably right. You see, it's very, very difficult for patriotic Americans. Now, most of the veterans were fellows that went into the war and they went in really believing they were doing something worthwhile for the country. This was particularly true of World War II. I remember I was one of those guys that went down all starry-eyed with patriotism the day after Pearl Harbor. And I said, by gosh, they're not going to do that to my country.
Oh, yeah.
And I went down there and I thought, here we're fighting a war, and this is going to be a war to protect democracy in the United States. And it wasn't until years and years later that I learned that it was a put-up thing, we were suckered into it, and that all the benefits of World War II went into the communist camp and into the Zionist camp.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to this question. What should happen when a soldier discovers that his commander is Benedict Arnold or someone similar?
Well, I don't think there's anything that a patriotic soldier can do but either first try to expose him, and this has been tried on a number of occasions, and usually the man that tries to expose him gets slapped down very hard.
Yeah.
I know from sad experience in dealing with the State Department of this, personal experience. I also know that well, let me give you an example. Let's say we're a squad of men standing out here waiting to move somewhere, and they hear the general come along and tell the sergeant in charge of the group, Sergeant, I want you to move your men to the west. And the general gets in his Jeep and drives off, and after he's left, the sergeant stands in front of the men and calls them to attention and said, men, we're going to move to the east. Now, what are they supposed to do? They heard the general, who is the higher commander, give the order to move to the west, and here's the man who is their immediate commander says, move to the east. Well, they would be actually legally in the right to say, we are not going to follow the sergeant because we know the general doesn't want us to move that way. Yeah. But there are very, very few people, after they've been trained, particularly our officers' corps, in the West Point and in other places, they are trained to obey implicitly any order that's given to them. Yeah. And really, when you come right down to it, we're not any different than the German soldiers were during World War II. Yeah. We raised so much hell about the Nazi soldiers and the terrible things they did. All they were doing were following the same orders that American soldiers follow, you see. And it's a sad situation. When you've got a man that is a crook, you got a man that's a traitor, you got a man that's going against everything that you stand for, and you're led to believe that you've got to do everything he tells you, whether it's right or wrong. Yeah. Oh, it's a serious situation for a man in service. That's one reason why today I'm very leery about advising a young man to get into the service anymore.
Yes, I know what you mean. Did we even intend to win in Vietnam?
All the evidence proves that there was no intention of winning in Vietnam any more than there was in Korea. If you go back and study some of the things that were done in the State Department prior to Korea, you will find out that a statement was made that we will let Korea go into the communist camp, but we must be very careful to make it look like we didn't push them into the communist camp. And so as a result of that, we did absolutely nothing to build up the South Korean military force, although we knew that the North Koreans were getting ready to invade. If I had 2 hours, I could tell you of personal experiences where I saw where the State Department deliberately withheld information of enemy build-up in North and kept it from General Willoughby, who was MacArthur's intelligence chief, because they didn't want the people to know about it. They wanted South Korea to fall for some reason.
Is that why they call it just a police action? They had no intention of it being a war and winning it?
They had no intention of ever being in a war. Another thing, we fought it under United Nations control, which meant that every single order that went down to MacArthur and then to the field commanders first went through the Undersecretary of Military and Political Affairs in the United Nations, who was a Russian general at that time. How in the world can you fight the enemy when he knows what you're going to do ahead of time? General Walker over in Korea, the field commander, used to say, how in the hell can I fight a war when the enemy know what I'm going to do before I do, you see?
We wouldn't have invited Rommel to sit in on our meeting.
That is right. But this is what was happening, and then the same thing happened in Vietnam, and every evidence was that we heard so much about the immorality of the war in Vietnam. It was an immoral war. I don't think it was immoral because we went to Vietnam to fight the communists. We should have done that. I don't think it was immoral because we backed up the South Vietnamese. We had a treaty with them to help defend them. But it was immoral because we sent our men over there. First, we tied their hands behind their back to where they couldn't fight. Many times we wouldn't even let them load their weapons until they were fired on by the enemy. Yeah. We wouldn't let them, like you mentioned the other day, that in all the bombing of the cities of World War II that we did, how come they didn't bomb Hanoi?
We couldn't wait to get to Tokyo or Berlin.
No, that's right. We couldn't wait to destroy Berlin. We couldn't wait to destroy Dresden. We couldn't wait to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but suddenly when it came to a communist city, we wouldn't touch it. We weren't allowed to touch it.
Okay, that's something I think you should mention. Why did they select Nagasaki, and why did they select Hiroshima when neither one of those were military bases?
Well, it's very interesting to note that the drive all down through these years and every one of the great wars that we've been fought, the underlying motive that most people don't know about was the destruction of Christians and the destruction of Christian wealth and Christian country.
Dresden could be included in
Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the two largest Christian centers in Japan.
Yeah. How about Dresden?
I don't know about Dresden. Only thing that I know about Dresden is that it was a non-military target inhabited by about 250,000 women and children.
Right.
No military target whatsoever. And that the very interesting to note that the drive that to urge Truman hit Nagasaki and the drive to bomb the German cities after and kill the German civilians when there was no military target around, all came on the advice of very high-ranking Zionists that were in the American military at that time.
It goes back to Yalta.
Mm-hmm.
You get Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt sitting around the table deciding how they're going to divide up Europe and give it to the
That's right. You see,
communist. Why?
Some of our patriotic commanders like General Patton and General Montgomery on the British side, they realized that the war could be ended a lot sooner than what it was, with tremendous number less casualties than what were suffered, and that we could liberate all of Eastern Europe by an attack coming up through Italy, up through the soft underbelly of Europe. But they wouldn't do that. Eisenhower and Churchill and Stalin and FDR, they held out for the Normandy landing, which took months later. God only knows how many, probably 250,000 people of military, and God knows how many million civilians died during that period of time. Possibly some of them estimate that in that 18 months, the Allies spent as much as $50 billion that they could have saved by the other way, and they did it because the people behind the scenes, the one that were pulling the strings behind the scenes, wanted to see the communists in control of all of Western Europe.
I was just thinking, today is Memorial Day, 1985. We just heard a speech about it, and you know, there's every year, Memorial Day, it always bothers me, because all they ever talk about is the military who died. What about the women and children? No mention of them.
No mention of the women and children that were killed. I think maybe primarily because of the fact that we didn't lose any women and children in this country.
Yeah.
This country's never been hit. You know, we've been very fortunate since the Civil War. We've never had an attack against American soil, and I wonder what the reaction will be. I remember during the war years, I heard so many American women would say about the German women and the French women and the English women when they would become prostitutes in order to feed their family, and they would say how terrible those women would. I often wondered what would have happened if they saw their family starving, you see, here in the United States, and the same sort of thing. It's so easy for us to say, well, we do things a certain way when we've never had pressure brought against us. But America has been so blessed by having peace on our soil that I almost shiver in my shoes to think of the reaction what would be if, let's say, for instance, the Soviet Union did nothing more or less than drop one small atomic bomb on a big city. I don't think they'll drop it on New York because there are too many of their people that are in New York.
Well, if any place has got to go, let's drop it on San Francisco.
Yeah, let's San Francisco or maybe Chicago or someplace like that, and kill off a few thousand Americans, and then come to them and say, this is an example of what's going to happen to you. Either come to terms with us or we're going to wipe you out. And I think we would find, unfortunately, many, many Americans, particularly in the churches.
I was going to say the preachers would be the first ones to throw their hands up.
Preachers would be the first ones to throw their hands up and say, we better give up or we're going to get wiped out, you see. And it's a very sad situation when we find a country like America that has always been a strong, moral country and took a strong stand on issues like freedom, to see how they have emasculated this country of ours in recent years to where we're actually becoming a nation of cowards.
Yeah. I have one last question. How important is it that the veteran understands who the enemy is?
You can't fight a war of any kind at all. You can't defend yourself if you don't know who the enemy is and what his reactions are going to be. Anybody that's ever served in the service knows that this is true. And yet there are some men that have tried to warn their people. General Edwin Walker, for instance, a few years ago in Europe, he was the commander of the NATO forces over there, one of the divisions, American divisions in the NATO forces, and he felt that it was extremely important that his men knew what communism was all about. So he began a training program to train them about communism, and he ended up getting fired.
Sure. Yeah.
He ended up getting fired. Why? Because the people behind the scenes, these are the people that are pulling the strings in government. And Paul, we have not had in Washington, D.C., an American government for at least 50 years. We've had an alien government. Now, I'm not talking now about the Reagan administration or the Carter administration or Ford or Eisenhower and them. I'm talking about the people behind the scenes who pull the strings that run the government. And it doesn't matter whether the Republicans or Democrats or independents are in. The same policies are carried out because these very, very powerful people. And the American people, particularly our church people, have been so, and the veterans too, unfortunately, and I'm one of them, have been so brainwashed with the stuff that has been put out on the wars and who has been responsible for the wars that the average American doesn't even know how we were suckered into World War I or II and Vietnam and Korea. And the terrible, terrible price that we paid, not only in money, in deaths, but in suffering in this country so that a few men could get fabulously wealthy.
The way the average civilian is brainwashed, and the public schools are totally brainwashing this next generation, and many of the World War II veterans are going to be too old. The World War I veterans are gone. It looks to me like Korea and Vietnam veterans are about the only ones that are going to be able to help us.
You cannot, Paul, you cannot find in any public school in the United States of America today a history book that tells you the truth about World War I, World War II, Vietnam, or Korea. Not a one. Not a one. They have twisted the truth about it, that our young people have a completely wrong idea of what happened during that period of time.
Well, I guess we're out of time. As you can see, this conversation could go on and on and on. Like I said, we'd like to have you duplicate this tape and get it out to as many people as you think would be interested in it. Jack, thanks a lot.
My pleasure.